objections to my theory I have not addressed in this book. I thought that's interesting. So he knew there were serious objections and he didn't address them in the book. And so I thought that was an interesting way to close his book. Evolutionary ideas were popular in Europe in the 18th century. And Lyell was the geologist whose 3 volumes he read on the ship Beagle that profoundly colored his way of looking at the facts of nature. Thomas Henry Huxley, the greatest defender of evolutionists, particularly Darwin, never accepted Darwin's conclusions, and his personal biographer said that Huxley was at no time a convinced believer of the theory he protected. That's interesting. October 23, 1996, Pope John Paul II, in a formal statement sent to the Vatican's Pontifical Academy of Science, announced that evolution was a scientific theory acceptable to the Church. That surprised some people, but he was only reiterating the official position of his Church. In May of '82, on the 100th anniversary of Charles Darwin's death, the Academy of Science held a conference of scientists in honor of Darwin and issued this statement. We are convinced that the masses of evidence render the application of the concept of evolution to man and other primates beyond serious dispute. And I put this on the screen just to remind ourselves that in the Christian world today, the larger majority of churches have accepted theistic evolution as the understanding of Genesis 1. And I think that's so amazing because they are accepting that just at the very time when real, credible, observable science is loudly saying just exactly the opposite. So where did the idea of evolution start? It is the core of the lie of the serpent to Eve in the garden. When in the garden, Satan told Eve, if you will partake of this forbidden knowledge, you will become like God. And you will know the difference between good or evil, and exalted mankind to a level with God or equal with God. And when you're equal with God, then there is no God. Himself becomes its own idol. Wilberhurst, in his book, The Meaning of Masonry, this evolution of man into a Superman was always the purpose of ancient mysteries, occultism. Man was sprung from the earth and developed through the lower kingdoms of nature to his present rational state, has yet to complete his evolution by becoming a godlike being, unifying his conscience with omniscience. We must establish in theological minds the theory of evolution, the doctrine of reincarnation. Our work with modern science is of vital importance, so said the Occult Digest, January 1931. Last night we noticed that the study of origins is not science. It never has been and never will be, because origins cannot be observed, neither can it be tested or repeated. And that is the dictionary definition of science. And so no matter how devotedly they may devote themselves to the study of origins, origins is not and cannot and never will be science. It is a theory of origins. And origins, as we noticed last night, is actually a study of history, ancient, of the oldest kind. We said creationists have a bias. They look at a fact of nature and a conclusion is drawn. And evolutionists also have a bias, a fact of nature. They look at that and a conclusion is drawn. And both are looking at the same fact, but they radically interpret it very differently depending on the presuppositions with which they approach the subject of origins. And what I want to share with you this morning is a different way of looking at this controversy. A naturalist was out studying nature. And as he was studying nature and he was looking around, he heard a death cry. And a death cry in nature is like somebody scraping their fingernails on a blackboard. It doesn't fit. Something was dying. He looked around, and there he saw a serpent crawling along on the ground with a mouse in its mouth. And in nature, their nature is aroused, and he thought, you know, I'm going to go over there and rescue this mouse from the serpent. And as he got ready to run over there, the snake came to a tree and started to go up the tree with a mouse in his mouth, and it was just crying out, when suddenly a second mouse came around the base of the tree and ran up after the departing serpent. The scientists watched in amazement as that brave second little mouse got on the back of that snake and began to bite, and anybody that's dealt with mice know they have very sharp teeth. And they can inflict a pretty good wound, and the snake didn't like it. He was trying to knock this mouse off his footing, and that brave little mouse ran right up to the head of that serpent, began to bite at the mouth of that snake, and he didn't like it, and he's jerking his head around, and finally that brave second mouse got right in the back of the snake, and he really began to bite. Now, the snake had a problem. He couldn't deal with mouse number 2 because his mouth was full of mouse number 1, and he was afraid if he opened his mouth, mouse number 1 would get away, and so he held on. But finally the biting got so bad he had to deal with mouse number 2, and sure enough he opened his mouth, and the first mouse hopped out and ran down the tree, and the second one ran right after him. And I think the words of Scripture were ringing in the serpent's ears, the way of the transgressor is hard. Hard. Because in the real world of observable science, not Hollywood, but in the real world of observable science, the prey and the predator are almost always equally matched, with the advantage going to the prey, not the predator. A predator is a misnomer in the world of nature. It did not naturally belong there. It came as a result of sin. But here's the big question I want to ask you. Where did that brave second mouse find the courage and the bravery and the self-denial at the risk of its life to take on himself? Where did he get that? That is not the principle of the survival of the fittest of Darwin. This is a different principle. This is the principle of self-denial. Laying down one's life to protect another. Another naturalist was looking. He was actually a shepherd, and he looked out with his binoculars one morning, and there he saw a sheep. And they were all there, and a coyote stepped out of the forest and started toward the sheep, and he thought, you know, I'm going to lose a sheep. When to his amazement, little Billy was a billy goat, and he wasn't very big, and he wasn't full grown, he was just a little billy goat, stepped out from the flock and started towards the coyote, and he thought, oh no, Billy, you'll end up lunch. But he watched as that little billy goat came towards the coyote, and then he lowered his head and bam, he hit the side of that startled coyote and took a step back, and then bam, he hit it again, and this time the coyote turned tail and ran. But the question is this: where did that billy goat find the bravery and the courage and the self-denial at the risk of his life to take on a coyote in order to peck sheep, not even of his own kind? I want to suggest for your thinking this morning that the principle of the cross is found written on everything God ever made.